My, I would rather go back and look at the issue a little bit differently. I'd like to look at it a little bit more in depth. One thing that I see missing oftentimes in the discussion on same-sex marriage, and if it is brought up, it's brought up in a fashion that assumes that everybody knows what we're talking about. Is the concept of marriage itself. Same-sex marriage, that's half the term, right? All too often we get focused on the first half of that, the same sex and the same-sex aspect of it, and we debate homosexuality and the moral status of it and everything. And people oftentimes lose sight of the issue that what is actually being discussed here is marriage. Same sex is the qualifier, right? So I want to talk about marriage and ask you, have you ever thought about what in the world marriage is? Have you ever thought about just in general, what is marriage? What is marriage? Because I think that if we start with that question, some of the other questions might answer themselves in terms of what we believe about same-sex marriage. And we can find out why people reach the end of the conclusion that they do, one way or the other. Because what is marriage? Does marriage allow for us to just add any sort of qualifier onto the front of it as we want? It would seem to indicate that if we talk about marriage and we have to add a qualifier, then that qualifier is something that's a bit out of normal. I think that works that way with anything. If we talk about a book, for instance, we all have in mind a certain kind of book. When we add a qualifier in there, though, that's a specific, that brings a specific kind of, denotes a specific kind of book. So if you say the blue book, for instance, or the red book, or the book about ethics, which is the greatest book. No, not the greatest. Maybe the second greatest. But anyway, so we so that brings a very specific. It brings attention to a very specific kind of book. Maybe a book we haven't considered before. Okay, so marriage, when we add a qualifier like same-sex marriage or polygamous marriage or something like that, that means that, wait a second, if we have to add the qualifier, then one reason might be is because this is something that maybe we've not considered before, and we need to specify what we're talking about. So what is marriage? What is marriage? Just in general, because different cultures have conceived of marriage differently. But for instance, there have been marriages in culturally legitimized marriages, oftentimes that go beyond what we've practiced traditionally in Western culture for the last 100 years or so. There have been cultures throughout the world where polygamy has been part of what takes place, and so polygamy is where a person has multiple spouses, and this happens not only in the situation like with the early Latter-day Saints or even the group, the sister wives group that you see there, where you have one husband with many wives. This also has taken place in various Eastern cultures where one wife or one woman will have several husbands, and so and that was a culturally legitimized thing. In many Muslim cultures today, people are permitted to have up to 4 wives. Men are permitted to have up to 4 wives, and that is a societally acceptable thing. And so different cultures have conceived of marriages differently throughout history. As we go back, we can see that. So what is marriage, and what sort of function does it accomplish in a culture? Well, one thing is, in most every culture that we've ever seen, most every culture has regulated marriage on a religious basis. It is not while the civil authorities might have recognized marriage and maybe even performed marriage. Marriage has been traditionally thought of as sort of something of religious significance. It is it takes place in the context of a religious joining together of people. That's not just the fact with us in Western tradition in recent times. But it has been the fact throughout history, even through different kinds of religions, different societies. And many of them have had their own spin on it and what takes place exactly, but most of them, a number of them have been they are conceived on a religious basis, which is an interesting innovation of recent times in our own culture, in American culture, and actually probably Western culture in general, is that as our society becomes religiously pluralistic, that means that we have more than one religion that is dominant in society. And as society increasingly, especially in America, excuse me, as society becomes increasingly secular, that means without reference to religion, we're now moving toward the innovation of having our civil government redefine what marriage is. And we either we legislate it, or we run it through the courts, or we do things like that to in an attempt to define what marriage is. That really is the way that people nowadays are moving toward a conception of marriage. But it hasn't traditionally been the way that people have thought of marriage. Usually, it's been thought of as a religious thing. And so how are we to make that? And what we're seeing, this debate about same-sex marriage, is largely evidences the fact of this, because the shift toward same-sex marriage and toward the acceptance of it in recent times has been really promoted by the idea that that same-sex couples deserve the same kinds of protections that are available to people who are married, and protections under the law, because people who are married can have access to several benefits, whether they be freedoms, whether they be certain tax exemptions and so forth. The people who are married have those protections under the law, whereas people who are not married do not. They have different benefits, different things, but they don't have those benefits under the law, those liberties under the law. So people who have a same-sex orientation, who have a same-sex preference in that way, have argued that because of that, marriage needs to be extended to them, which is an interesting way of approaching it. It's almost like the tail wagging the dog. So we have marriage. Marriage is a sort of religious institution. Government recognizes marriage and gives benefits to that relationship. And now a group that was excluded from the religious significance of marriage, but wants the benefits, wants the civil government to redefine the institution of marriage that was conceived originally as a religious thing. Now, in our society, religion is becoming less and less of a thing, and so many people don't see the problem with that. But it's an interesting way to approach the concept of marriage, as if it were a civil institution rather than a religious institution. But marriage has been around much longer, much since well before American civil government. In fact, there would be those who argue that marriage is the building block upon which civil government is based. In fact, if we look at the marriage as an institution, the basic family unit is established in the relationship of marriage, and the family itself is a building block of society. Did you ever think about the idea that where you learn to interact with civil authority, the first place that you learn how to interact with authority was in the context of your family, whatever that context might have been. Now, it may not have been a good situation. It may not have been an ideal situation. It may have been a place where authority was wielded in a very tyrannical way. But you learned how to interact with authority first through those who are raising you, whoever that might be. It might have been a father and a mother. It might have been either a father or a mother. It might have been a grandparent. It might have been an aunt or an uncle. It might have been a foster parent. It could have been any of those. But that's where you first learn how to interact with authority. And what you learned, the lessons you learned in the context of your family unit, then were carried on into society. And how you interacted with society, or the authority in society, was something that you learned in the family. Now, what that means then is that marriage, which is the foundation of the family, the marriage relationship is foundational to society because it teaches new members of society how to interact and relate with authority in their lives. And I often say in my counseling practice, my family counseling practices, when I counsel families and I counsel young people in sort of strange domestic situations, one of the things that I encourage them to do is make a conscious effort toward respecting or interacting with the authority in their family, because the habits that they form now are going to be the habits that they carry into, for instance, their job, and they have to submit to the authority of their boss. Well, if you don't do that, and if you don't know how to do that and interact with the authority of your boss at work, then you'll get fired and you won't be able to support yourself, and that's a bad thing. Or how they're going to interact with the authority of say the civil government. And so how you respect authority in the home is going to be reflected when you go out into the world and get out on your own and have to interact with civil authorities, things like judges and police officers and those who are charged with governing our society. The respect and the interaction that you learn at home is going to affect that later on. The family teaches people how to do that. The family teaches new citizens or up-and-coming citizens, how to do that. And marriage is the foundation of that family. So marriage itself forms a foundation, an incubator, if you will, for citizens, for new citizens and new, for the next generation and so forth. So that's one thing that we need to take into consideration, that marriage fills that function no matter where it's at in society. Marriage fills the function of forming the family, which is the foundational building block of the next generation. So that is one function of marriage in relationship to society. And so then we should ask ourselves, are there certain forms of marriage, or are there certain things in certain kinds of marriage, arrangements, if you will, that work better than others? And how fast and hard are those rules that define the marriage relationship, which define the family? What are those rules? Hard and fast? How flexible are they? Well, now earlier in the course, we talked about a concept of core morality. And if you remember back when we talked about core morality, we said that core morality is a view of objective ethics that believes that there are certain core moral principles by which a society must recognize, and they must practice them in order to survive as a society. If they don't, then the society will suffer to a certain extent. So we have things like valuing human life. If a society does not value human life, then it's going to not flourish. It's just not going to flourish. People are going to be paranoid about who's after them all the time. They're going to be plotting against others, and people are going to spend more time watching over their back than they are doing things like developing culture and making architecture and paintings and mathematics and science and all this stuff. So they're going to be worried about their own survival rather than that. And so a common respect for human life is necessary for society to flourish. That is a core morality that all societies that have flourished recognize. Okay, so you remember the concept of core morality. And so the question we want to ask is, are there certain forms of marriage, are there principles that surround the marriage relationship that form a core morality such that if those principles are violated, it leads to the downfall or the diminishment of society? Because as we look throughout different cultures, we can see that different forms of marriage have been practiced. And people have tried to define marriage in a way that they saw fit, and has that helped society along? So anyway, that's a topic of a discussion that could be a doctoral thesis, I think. But I bring the question up to ask you to consider when we consider monogamy versus polygamy, and then bring into the idea of same-sex marriage and others, or even what they call open marriage, which is where two spouses are sexually active with their full knowledge outside of marriage. Now, of those types of marriage, and one could probably think of several other arrangements, are there certain types of those relationships that actually work better in society than others? and one would have to go down and look at how societies, when they have conceived of marriage in this way, versus this way, versus this way, versus this way, how has that led for society to flourish or to diminish? How has that affected society either for the good or bad? And now this is not a philosophical thing so much as it would be an interesting sociological study. Sociological meaning go back and look at the societies where this has happened. Now some people will argue, well, monogamous marriage between one man, one woman, has been the backbone of our society and of every flourishing society in the world. And every society that has accepted these other versions of what marriage is, to the extent that they have, has undermined the family unit, and the family unit has then, because it's been undermined and weakened, will lead to the downfall of society. And that's that is a core morality or natural law argument for consideration that it would be good to look at. But marriage itself as an institution is a building block of society, whereby new members of society, or up and coming, the next generation, learn to first interact with authority in society and interact in relationally with society as well. It forms a basic body politic. How are decisions made? How are they followed? What is the extent and the nature of rules and regulation? Those are all learned in the family, and so it would bear investigation. The idea of looking into and conceiving what marriage is before we get onto the idea of whether or not same-sex marriage is a moral thing to do. Well, that is what I want to talk about today. We've looked at some various considerations, and I would have you evaluate various. If you have questions on whether or not certain sex acts are good or activities are good, these are just principles by which people normally have judged them. It's beyond the scope of our discussion really to go back and look in depth into each one of these type of activities and so forth. But these are some different considerations, and as you're sort of thinking about and thinking through what your approach is on these things, these are things to keep in mind. Well, I hope to see you back next week, and hopefully I'm not in a body cast from falling down some rocks or something like that. But I do look forward to looking and seeing what you guys have been discussing, and we might talk a little bit about this when we get back. But be ready for those of you who are going to be doing your oral presentations. Be ready with those. Go ahead and get to work on the second series for your position paper. And I will see you next week where we can engage these things further. All right. Have a great one. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.